In the early morning hours of March 15th, Millbrook Correctional Annex implemented its controversial mixed-gender housing pilot program. The facility, originally designed as a women's prison, had been hastily converted to accommodate male inmates in the East Wing while maintaining female housing in the West. The decision came down from the State Corrections Department as an emergency measure to address severe overcrowding across the system. Heather Martinez sat on the edge of her narrow bunk in cell W-237, staring at the cracked concrete wall. At 22, she was serving an 18-month sentence for check fraud and identity theft, crimes born from desperation rather than greed. Her father had abandoned the family when she was 5, leaving her mother to struggle with addiction until her death from an overdose when Heather was 16. The pattern of abandonment had followed Heather through foster care and into adulthood, leaving her with an almost pathological need for connection. The first sign of the new arrangement came through the ventilation system. A rusted grate near the ceiling of her cell connected to an air duct that ran between the two wings. What had once carried only the sound of air circulation now carried voices from the male block. Late at night, when the prison settled into its uneasy quiet, Heather could hear fragments of conversation, laughter, and sometimes arguments drifting through the metal passages. During her second week in the mixed housing arrangement, one voice stood out from the rest. Deep, smooth, and confident, it seemed to be addressing her directly through the darkness. The voice belonged to Tremaine Jackson, a 28-year-old serving 8 years for armed robbery and aggravated assault. What Heather didn't know was that Tremaine had specifically researched her case through the prison's informal information network, learning about her charges, her background, and most importantly, her psychological vulnerabilities. Tremaine had spent 6 years in various correctional facilities, learning to read people like books. He understood that survival inside required allies, and allies required leverage. Some inmates could be bought with drugs or protection. Others, like Heather, could be manipulated through their desperate need for love and validation. Her case file, accessible through an inmate clerk who owed him favors, painted a picture of a young woman destroyed by abandonment and willing to do anything for genuine affection. The conversations began innocently enough. Tremaine would speak into the vent during the late evening hours, sharing fabricated stories about his wrongful conviction and his pending appeal. He described himself as a victim of circumstance, a good man trapped by a corrupt system. His voice carried a mixture of vulnerability and strength that Heather found irresistible. She began responding through her own vent, sharing details about her life, her fears, and her dreams of starting over when her sentence ended. Tremaine was methodical in his approach. He employed techniques perfected through years of manipulation, love-bombing Heather with constant praise and attention, future-faking with detailed plans about their life together after release, and gradually isolating her from other inmates by suggesting they were jealous of their special connection. He spoke about the house they would rent, the jobs they would find, even the children they would have together. For Heather, these conversations became the highlight of her existence, the only thing that made prison bearable. By the third week, their nightly conversations had become sexually charged. Tremaine fed Heather elaborate fantasies about their physical relationship, describing in intimate detail what he would do to her if they could be together. For Heather, these conversations were expressions of love and intimacy. For Tremaine, they were a calculated step toward exploiting her growing obsession. The breakthrough came when Officer Marcus Burke, a 15-year veteran of the corrections system, began to notice the pattern of Heather's behavior. Burke was struggling with his own demons, a gambling addiction that had left him drowning in debt and desperate for additional income. When he overheard fragments of Heather and Tremaine's conversations during his night rounds, he saw opportunity rather than a violation to report. Burke approached Heather during her work detail in the prison laundry. He had done his research too, learning about her family's modest savings account and her access to commissary funds. His proposition was simple. For $500 wired to his sister's account in Atlanta, he would arrange for Heather to have a 30-minute private meeting with Tremaine during his night shift. The money would have to come from her commissary account, funds her grandmother had deposited for her legal defense. Heather's desperation overrode any sense of caution. She had never experienced the kind of emotional connection she felt with Tremaine, and the thought of being physically close to him consumed her every waking moment. She agreed to Burke's terms without hesitation, emptying her commissary account to pay for what she believed would be a romantic encounter with the man she loved. The first meeting took place in a storage room near the laundry facility. For Heather, it was the culmination of weeks of emotional buildup, a physical manifestation of the love she believed they shared. For Tremaine, it was a calculated performance designed to deepen her emotional dependence while establishing a new avenue for his drug smuggling operations. He had already begun using their relationship to move contraband between the male and female blocks, with Heather unknowingly serving as a courier. In the days following their first physical encounter, Heather's behavior became increasingly erratic. She carved Tremaine's initials into her thigh with a sharpened toothbrush handle, telling herself it was a romantic gesture that proved her devotion. She began talking openly to other inmates about her relationship, describing Tremaine as her soulmate and future husband. Most concerning of all, she started stealing pregnancy tests from the prison infirmary, taking them obsessively even though she couldn't possibly be pregnant yet. The stolen pregnancy tests represented something deeper than physical reality for Heather. They symbolized her desperate hope that her relationship with Tremaine would become permanent, that a child would create an unbreakable bond between them. She took test after test, each negative result a disappointment that only strengthened her resolve to continue their relationship. 3 weeks after their first meeting, Heather's persistence was rewarded. The thin blue line appeared on her stolen pregnancy test, confirming what she had hoped for since their first encounter. As she whispered the news through the ventilation system to Tremaine, her voice trembling with joy and expectation, she had no way of knowing that his reaction was not celebration but cold calculation. Tremaine understood immediately that a pregnancy changed everything. A child would create a permanent connection between them, physical evidence of their relationship that could be used against him by authorities or by Heather herself if she ever decided to expose his operations. What Heather interpreted as the beginning of their future together, Tremaine recognized as the beginning of a problem that would need to be solved. As he lay in his bunk that night, staring at the ceiling, he was already formulating a plan to eliminate the threat that Heather Martinez had become. 2 weeks after discovering her pregnancy, Heather's behavior shifted dramatically. She began treating her body like a sacred vessel, refusing the processed prison food in favor of hoarded fruit and vegetables traded from other inmates. She fashioned a makeshift journal from torn pages of library books, filling it with elaborate plans for their future family. Page after page contained detailed baby name lists: Tremaine Jr. for a boy, Destiny, or Heaven for a girl. She drew crude sketches of nursery layouts, complete with cribs, rocking chairs, and walls decorated with alphabet letters. The fantasy planning consumed every moment of Heather's free time. She created elaborate timelines mapping out Tremaine's release date, her own parole eligibility, and the baby's due date. In her mind, everything aligned perfectly. Tremaine's appeal would be successful, reducing his sentence. She would give birth in the prison hospital, and somehow they would be released together to start their new life. The details of how this would actually work remained vague in her planning, but Heather's desperation allowed her to ignore the practical impossibilities. Her cellmate, Maria Santos, watched this transformation with growing concern. Heather had always been intense, but the pregnancy news had pushed her into a manic state that bordered on delusional. She spoke constantly about Tremaine as if he were her husband, referring to him by pet names and sharing intimate details about their relationship with anyone who would listen. She began saving portions of her meals, claiming she needed to eat for 2, and fashioned baby clothes from torn sheets and towels. Meanwhile, Tremaine Jackson was experiencing his own transformation, though his was driven by cold calculation rather than maternal joy. The news of Heather's pregnancy had triggered a carefully controlled panic. In his 6 years of incarceration, he had learned to compartmentalize problems and develop solutions methodically. A pregnant woman claiming to carry his child represented multiple threats: physical evidence of their relationship, potential leverage for blackmail, and a permanent connection that could complicate his existing relationships both inside and outside prison. Tremaine's primary concern was Keisha Williams, his girlfriend of 4 years who lived in New Orleans with their 2 children. Keisha had been faithfully waiting for his release, visiting regularly and managing his affairs on the outside. She controlled his commissary deposits, maintained contact with his family, and had been planning their wedding for when he was released. A pregnant prison girlfriend would destroy not only their relationship but also his support system and his prospects for successful reintegration into society. Despite his private panic, Tremaine maintained his loving facade during his conversations with Heather. He continued to feed her fantasies about their future together, describing in detail the house they would rent, the jobs they would find, and how wonderful she would look pregnant with his child. These conversations served multiple purposes. They kept Heather emotionally dependent on him, they provided cover for his drug smuggling operations, and they bought him time to develop a long-term solution to the problem she represented. The drug smuggling had escalated significantly since their physical relationship began. Tremaine had established connections with suppliers in both the male and female blocks, using Heather as an unwitting courier to move pills, marijuana, and other contraband between the wings. Her pregnancy provided perfect cover for these operations, as pregnant inmates were searched less thoroughly and given more privacy during medical visits. Heather believed she was helping with small favors for their future together, unaware that she was participating in a sophisticated drug distribution network. As her pregnancy progressed, Heather's need for validation and recognition grew stronger. She began writing letters to everyone she could think of who might have a connection to Tremaine. Her first letter went to his mother in New Orleans, introducing herself as his fiancée and asking for advice about raising children. She wrote to his lawyer, claiming to have important information about his case that could help with his appeal. Each letter was filled with intimate details about their relationship, descriptions of their future plans, and references to the baby they were expecting together. The most dangerous letter was addressed to Keisha Williams. Heather had discovered Keisha's name and address through Tremaine's legal documents, carelessly left visible during one of their meetings. The letter was a masterpiece of delusion and unintentional cruelty, written from the perspective of a woman who believed she was Tremaine's true love finally reaching out to his former girlfriend. In the letter, Heather described their sexual relationship in explicit detail, claiming that Tremaine had told her he had never experienced such passion with anyone else. She revealed information about his drug smuggling operations, naming specific inmates and describing the methods used to move contraband between blocks. She provided details about Burke's involvement and the payment system used to arrange their meetings. Most damaging of all, she claimed that Tremaine had told her he was only maintaining contact with Keisha out of obligation, and that his real future was with Heather and their unborn child. The letter reached Keisha Williams on a Tuesday afternoon in early May. The letter destroyed her world in a matter of minutes, revealing not only that the man she loved had been cheating on her, but that he had been using another woman to commit crimes that could extend his sentence indefinitely. Keisha's response was immediate and devastating. She called the prison that same evening, demanding to speak with Tremaine during his scheduled phone time. The conversation was automatically recorded, creating a permanent record of her fury and threats. More dangerous for Tremaine was Keisha's threat to contact the authorities about his drug operations. She had specific details from Heather's letter about inmates involved, methods used, and Burke's role in facilitating the crimes. If she followed through on her threats, Tremaine would face additional charges that could add decades to his sentence. Following the disastrous phone call with Keisha, Tremaine realized that Heather Martinez had transformed from a useful tool into an existential threat. Her unpredictable behavior, her detailed knowledge of his operations, and her apparent willingness to share that information with anyone who would listen made her too dangerous to allow to continue living. Tonya Hill earned her nickname Red not from her auburn hair, but from the blood she had spilled during the double homicide that landed her a life sentence without parole. At 34, she had spent the last 8 years establishing herself as an enforcer within the prison hierarchy, someone who solved problems for the right price. Her reputation was built on calculated violence and absolute discretion, qualities that made her invaluable to inmates who needed serious work done. When Tremaine Jackson's intermediary approached Red about a problem that needed solving, she listened with the detached interest of a professional evaluating a job offer. The intermediary was Carlos Mendez, a gang associate who owed both men favors. The conversation took place in the prison chapel during Sunday service, with their voices masked by hymns echoing off the concrete walls. The proposition was straightforward but lucrative. Tremaine needed a female inmate eliminated quickly and quietly. The target was Heather Martinez, a young woman who had become a liability to ongoing operations. The payment structure reflected the seriousness of the request, immediate protection for Red from rival gangs, guaranteed access to premium drugs and contraband, and $2,000 deposited into her daughter's college fund in Georgia. Red's daughter Shayla was 16 and living with Red's mother, working toward a scholarship to study nursing. The money would secure her future in ways that Red's life of violence never could. She agreed to the job within 24 hours of the initial approach, understanding that sentiment was a luxury she had abandoned years ago. The planning phase required Red to study Heather's daily routine with the patience of a predator. She learned that Heather spent most of her recreational time in the main yard, often exercising alone near the weight bench while other inmates clustered in social groups. Heather's isolation worked in Red's favor, as did her reputation for being mentally unstable since her pregnancy announcement. Red crafted her weapon from a plastic food tray handle, sharpening it against the concrete wall of her cell during the quiet hours before dawn. The process took 3 weeks of careful work, gradually transforming the innocuous plastic into a blade capable of inflicting fatal wounds. She tested the weapon's effectiveness on cardboard, refining the edge until it could penetrate with minimal resistance. The weapon's concealment required creativity and planning. Red modified the waistband of her prison-issued workout clothes, creating a hidden pocket that would hold the sharpened plastic against her lower back. She practiced the drawing motion until it became instinctive, a fluid movement that would give her target no time to react. Officer Burke's cooperation was secured through additional payment and implicit threats about his existing involvement in Tremaine's operations. His role was simple but crucial: ensure that his patrol route kept him at the opposite end of the yard during the planned attack, and delay any response to disturbances for at least 10 minutes. The attack was scheduled for a Wednesday afternoon during general population yard time. Red positioned herself near the weight bench area, pretending to spot for another inmate while keeping Heather in her peripheral vision. Heather arrived alone as usual, beginning her exercise routine with the focused intensity of someone trying to maintain normalcy despite her deteriorating mental state. Red approached Heather casually, commenting on her workout routine and asking about her pregnancy. The conversation appeared friendly to distant observers, 2 inmates sharing casual conversation in the prison yard. Red expressed sympathy about Heather's situation, suggesting they move to a more private area near the equipment storage shed, where they could talk without being overheard. The isolated location provided perfect cover for what followed. Red struck without warning, driving the sharpened plastic deep into Heather's abdomen before she could comprehend what was happening. The attack was frenzied but efficient, 27 wounds inflicted in less than 2 minutes. Heather's screams echoed across the yard, but the other inmates had been instructed to ignore any disturbance and continue their activities. Heather's attempts to defend herself were futile against Red's experience and determination. She tried to call for help, but her voice weakened as blood loss took its toll. She collapsed near the weight bench, her hands pressing against the wounds in a desperate attempt to stop the bleeding. Red stood over her victim for a moment, ensuring that the job was complete, before calmly walking away and discarding the weapon in a trash receptacle. The medical response was delayed exactly as planned. Burke's radio crackled with reports of a disturbance in the yard, but he was conveniently investigating a false alarm in the dining hall. By the time medical personnel reached Heather, she had lost too much blood to survive. The 17-week-old fetus died with her, another casualty of the violence that had consumed her mother's life. Red's cover story was prepared and rehearsed. She claimed that Heather had attacked her over a cigarette debt, forcing her to defend herself with whatever weapon she could find. The story was implausible given the severity of Heather's wounds, but it provided initial cover while the investigation developed. When news of Heather's death reached Tremaine through the prison's informal communication network, his reaction was notable for its complete absence of emotion. He was reading in his cell when Carlos Mendez passed by his door and whispered the simple message, "It's done." Tremaine nodded once, closed his book, and lay down on his bunk as if nothing significant had occurred. The problem that had threatened his operations and his future had been eliminated with the efficiency he had expected. Detective Maria Santos arrived at Millbrook Correctional Annex 3 days after Heather Martinez's murder, her experienced eyes immediately noting the institutional tension that permeated the facility. Santos had spent 15 years investigating prison violence, and she understood that brutal killings like this one rarely occurred in isolation. The warden's obvious discomfort during their initial briefing, the guards' evasive answers, and the inmates' collective silence all pointed to something far more complex than a simple altercation over cigarettes. The crime scene told a story that contradicted Red Hill's self-defense narrative from the moment Santos examined it. 27 stab wounds created a pattern of deliberate, methodical violence that spoke to premeditation rather than spontaneous conflict. The positioning of the wounds, concentrated in the abdomen and chest, indicated someone with knowledge of human anatomy and experience with inflicting fatal injuries. The weapon, recovered from a trash receptacle 50 yards from the attack site, had been carefully cleaned and disposed of in a manner that suggested planning rather than panic. Red's initial statement contained multiple inconsistencies that became apparent under detailed scrutiny. She claimed that Heather had initiated the confrontation by demanding cigarettes that Red owed her, but commissary records showed that Red had not purchased cigarettes in over 6 months. She described defending herself with a weapon she had found near the weight bench, but the sharpened plastic tray handle showed signs of careful modification that would have taken weeks to complete. Most significantly, Red's account of the attack sequence did not match the blood spatter pattern or the positioning of Heather's body when medical personnel arrived. The breakthrough came when Santos obtained access to the prison's phone records from the previous month. Every call made by inmates was automatically recorded and stored, creating a comprehensive database of communications that revealed patterns invisible to casual observation. Tremaine Jackson's calls to Keisha Williams painted a clear picture of escalating conflict, with Keisha becoming increasingly hostile and threatening as she learned about his relationship with Heather and his involvement in drug trafficking operations. More damaging were the conversations between Tremaine and his various associates within the prison system. Carlos Mendez had made several calls to outside contacts discussing cleaning up problems and handling situations that needed to be resolved quickly. The coded language was obvious to Santos, who had heard similar conversations in dozens of previous cases involving prison violence and gang operations. The most incriminating evidence came from a recorded conversation between Tremaine and his cousin Miguel, made 2 days before Heather's murder. The call was ostensibly about family matters, but embedded within the discussion were clear references to someone who needed to go and problems that couldn't be allowed to continue. Tremaine's exact words, preserved forever on digital recording, were chilling in their casual brutality. She had to go. That girl was gonna wreck everything we built. Armed with this evidence, Santos began systematically interviewing inmates who might have witnessed the planning or execution of Heather's murder. The prison's social dynamics made most inmates reluctant to cooperate, but Santos understood that every correctional facility contained individuals who were willing to trade information for consideration or protection. The key witness emerged in the form of Jessica Martinez, a drug offender serving time for possession with intent to distribute. Jessica's cell was positioned near the chapel where many of the planning conversations had taken place, and she had overheard fragments of discussions about eliminating Heather. More importantly, she had witnessed the payment negotiations between Tremaine's associates and Red Hill, including specific mentions of money being deposited into accounts for Red's daughter. Jessica's testimony provided the missing pieces that connected Tremaine's recorded conversations to Red's actions. She described overhearing Red discussing the best methods for attacking someone without leaving evidence, conversations about Officer Burke's cooperation in creating opportunities for violence, and detailed planning sessions about timing and execution. The information was specific enough to be credible and consistent enough with the physical evidence to be compelling. The investigation expanded beyond the immediate murder when Santos discovered the extent of the corruption network operating within Millbrook Correctional Annex. Burke's involvement was not limited to facilitating meetings between Heather and Tremaine. He had been accepting payments to ignore drug trafficking, to delay responses to violence, and to provide inmates with information about security procedures and staff schedules. The drug operation that Tremaine had been running was far more sophisticated than initially apparent. Using Heather as an unwitting courier was only one component of a network that involved multiple inmates, several guards, and outside contacts who supplied contraband and laundered money through various accounts. The operation had been generating thousands of dollars monthly, with proceeds being distributed among participants and used to bribe officials throughout the facility. When Santos confronted Red Hill with the accumulated evidence, the facade of her self-defense story crumbled completely. Faced with recorded conversations, witness testimony, and physical evidence that contradicted every aspect of her initial statement, Red understood that her situation was hopeless. Her lawyer advised cooperation in exchange for avoiding the death penalty, and Red began providing details about the murder conspiracy that filled in the remaining gaps in the investigation. Red's confession was comprehensive and damning. She described how Tremaine had recruited her through Carlos Mendez, the specific payments promised in exchange for killing Heather, and the detailed instructions provided about timing and method. She admitted to crafting the weapon over several weeks, studying Heather's routines to identify the optimal opportunity for attack, and coordinating with Burke to ensure that security response would be delayed. The confession also revealed the broader scope of corruption within the prison system. Red provided information about guards who had been accepting bribes, inmates who had been facilitating drug operations, and administrators who had been deliberately ignoring obvious signs of criminal activity. The network extended beyond Millbrook to include contacts at other facilities and connections to criminal organizations operating throughout the region. Santos realized that Heather Martinez's murder was not an isolated incident but rather the inevitable result of a systematic breakdown in institutional oversight and accountability. The young woman's death had exposed a web of corruption that had been operating for years, victimizing inmates and undermining the fundamental purpose of the correctional system. The indictments came down 6 weeks after Heather Martinez's murder, each one representing a different level of culpability in the conspiracy that had claimed her life and that of her unborn child. Tremaine Jackson faced charges of conspiracy to commit murder in the first degree, drug trafficking, and racketeering. The evidence against him was overwhelming: recorded phone conversations, witness testimony, and a paper trail of payments that connected him directly to Red Hill's actions. Tonya Hill was charged with first-degree murder, conspiracy, and weapons violations. Her detailed confession had provided prosecutors with a roadmap of the entire operation, but it had also sealed her fate. The brutality of the attack, combined with the premeditated nature of the crime, made her eligible for the death penalty. Her court-appointed attorney began immediately negotiating for life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Officer Marcus Burke's situation proved more complicated, highlighting the institutional protection that often shields corrupt officials from accountability. The Corrections Officers Union initially rallied to his defense, claiming that any cooperation with inmates was part of standard security operations designed to gather intelligence about potential threats. The prison administration characterized his involvement as an unfortunate lapse in judgment rather than systematic corruption. The protective walls around Burke began to crumble when Robert Martinez, Heather's devastated father, launched a relentless media campaign to expose the circumstances of his daughter's death. Martinez had lost his wife to cancer 3 years earlier, and Heather had been his only remaining family. Her death left him with nothing to lose and a burning need to ensure that her killers faced justice. Martinez hired a private attorney and began releasing information to local news outlets about the corruption at Millbrook Correctional Annex. He provided reporters with copies of Heather's letters describing her relationship with Tremaine, evidence of Burke's facilitation of their meetings, and documentation of the drug trafficking operation that had ultimately led to her murder. The story gained national attention when advocacy groups seized on it as an example of the failures inherent in the American correctional system. Under mounting public pressure and facing potential federal intervention, state prosecutors finally brought charges against Burke for corruption, conspiracy, and accessory to murder. The charges came too late to satisfy critics, but they represented an acknowledgement that institutional accountability could not be completely avoided when public attention remained focused on official misconduct. 2 months before his scheduled trial, Tremaine Jackson was found hanging in his cell during the early morning hours of a Tuesday in September. The official cause of death was ruled suicide, with prison officials citing the stress of facing life imprisonment and the isolation of protective custody as contributing factors. The timing was convenient for multiple parties who preferred that Tremaine's extensive knowledge of prison corruption die with him. The circumstances of Tremaine's death raised immediate suspicions among investigators and advocacy groups. He had been placed in a single cell under supposed protective custody, but security footage from the night of his death mysteriously malfunctioned. The makeshift noose was constructed from bedsheets in a manner that required knowledge and planning, yet Tremaine had shown no previous signs of suicidal ideation. Multiple inmates later reported seeing unfamiliar figures near his cell block on the night he died. Gang associates who had been cooperating with law enforcement suddenly became uncooperative after Tremaine's death, suggesting that his killing served as a warning to others who might consider revealing the full extent of criminal operations within the prison system. The message was clear: cooperation with authorities could be fatal, even in protective custody. The legal proceedings concluded with mixed results that reflected the complex web of culpability surrounding Heather's death. Red Hill accepted a plea agreement that spared her from execution in exchange for life imprisonment without parole. She would spend the remainder of her days in maximum security, her cooperation having bought her daughter's future at the cost of her own freedom. Burke received a sentence of 5 years for corruption and accessory to murder, a penalty that many considered inadequate given his role in facilitating the crimes that led to Heather's death. He served his time in minimum security and was released after 3 years for good behavior, quietly disappearing into anonymity with a government pension intact. The prison system implemented reforms that were largely cosmetic, designed more to manage public perception than to address the fundamental issues that had enabled Heather's murder. New oversight procedures were announced, staff training programs were expanded, and policies governing inmate interactions were revised. However, the underlying conditions that fostered corruption remained largely unchanged. The most poignant discovery came during the final cleanup of Heather's cell, when investigators found a letter she had written but never sent, hidden behind loose plaster near her bunk. The letter was addressed to Tremaine and dated 3 days before her death, representing her final attempt to reach the man she believed loved her. The letter read, "Even if you don't want us, this baby proves you loved me once. And that's enough. I know you're scared about being a father, but we can do this together. I dream about teaching our little girl to be strong like her daddy, or showing our son how to be a good man like you are inside. I see through your walls, baby. I know the real you is good. Forever yours, Heather and baby Jackson." The letter became a symbol of Heather's tragic delusion and the devastating consequences of manipulation and institutional failure. Her death sparked national discussions about prison reform, inmate safety, and the corruption that thrives in
En las
environments where
primeras
the
horas de la
vulnerable are
mañana del
exploited
15
by
de
those
marzo,
with power.
el anexo correccional de Millbrook